Please be seated, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to New College. I'm Helen Bond, head of the School of Divinity, and it's a particular delight to gather here today, not only because of the splendid nature of the occasion, but also because we are finally back in the beautiful surroundings of the Martin Hall after several years of fire asset protection work. So welcome back to the newly improved and indestructible New College. But let's not try it out. Inaugural lectures must be up there as one of the most important things that we do as a community. We come together to celebrate colleagues' achievements and to wish them continued success in the years to come. And I'm particularly pleased to be introducing today's lecturer, Professor Emma Wildwood. Emma is the holder of a personal chair in African religions and world Christianity. She's been a passionate ambassador for her subject ever since her arrival, only 5.5 years ago. And she's well known to many of our graduate students for the compassionate and energetic way that she went about her role as Director of Postgraduate Research during the pandemic. Professor Wildwood hails from Yorkshire. She has an impressive string of degrees, a BD, an MTH, and a PhD, all from that most august of institutions, the University of Edinburgh. She's also a Fellow of the Royal History Society and Senior Fellow of the HEA. Emma's first post was at the Institut Supérieur Théologique Anglican in Zaire from 1993 to 2000, combining her work there with the position of visiting lecturer at Bishop Tucker Theological College and Namugongo Martyrs Seminary, both in Uganda. She was an early pioneer of the part-time distance PhD, which she completed in 2004, after which she worked as a tutor in the Cambridge Theological Federation and for the publishing house SPCK. In 2009, she became the first female director of the Henry Martin Centre, now the Cambridge Centre for Christianity Worldwide, and lecturer in World Christianities in the University of Cambridge in 2015. She returned to Edinburgh as senior lecturer in African Indigenous Religions and African Christianity in January 2018. Throughout this time, she's held visiting appointments at various institutions, including the Anglican University of Congo and Tanzaga University College in Nairobi. She's currently co-director of the Centre for the Study of World Christianity and co-editor of the journal Studies in World Christianity with Dr. Alex Chow. And she was appointed to the Chair of African Religions and World Christianity in 2022. Professor Wildwood's research focuses on the modern social history, roughly 1800 to the present day, of religious movements in East Central Africa, particularly the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda. She's recently started to examine the relationship between faith and health in the region and in contemporary and historical perspective. During the pandemic, she collaborated with doctors Amuda Baba, Yosaway, and Sadiki Kangamina of the Anglican University of Congo and the Institut Supérieur Médical in Bunia, Professor Liz Grant of the Usher Institute, who I think is with us today, and Dr. Jean-Benoit Fallis, who is also, I think, in the audience. He's from the Centre of African Studies, and also Dr. Nigel Pearson. She collaborated with them all on an AHRC project to analyse the response of faith communities to COVID-19 and the introduction of public health measures. Emma has many career highlights already, and many more that we hope to come. She has 3 books, Migration and Christian Identity in Congo, published by Brill in 2008, Mission of Apollo Kivabolaya, Religious Encounter and Social Change in the Great Lakes, published by James Curry in 2020. And importantly for Emma, it also has an African publisher, Twaweza, in 2021. And linked to this publication is her third book, Archive of a Ugandan Missionary, the writings of and by Apollo Kivabolaya from 1895 to 1934, which sounds to me like a perfect mastermind title, should she wish to enter, but is in fact an annotated source book with introduction and translated with the help of George Mpanga, published by the British Academy OUP in 2022, and again with an African publisher, the Uganda Society, in 2023. I mentioned earlier that Emma held the role of Director of Postgraduate Studies during the pandemic. On a personal note, and I'm sure on behalf of our postgraduate students who remember those dark times, I want to say a particular thank you for her work. She and Dr. Sarah Parvis, who's in Australia and hopefully will be watching online, who was Director of Taught Postgraduate Studies, were determined to do everything they possibly could to make the pandemic experience as positive and inclusive as possible for our beleaguered students. This involved a sort of speed dating in Welcome Week to make friends quickly, and various walks and trips to coffee houses, which were less regulated at the time than university buildings. And it's a tribute to the pair of them and an excellent postgraduate committee that we got through the worst of COVID relatively unscathed. And I was delighted when, in December 2021, Emma and Sarah were awarded the University of Edinburgh Principal's Medal for postgraduate work. Now, you will very quickly be realizing that I could go on at very great length about what a wonderful colleague Emma is, and indeed have already done so. But I just want to mention one more thing, which I think gives us an insight into Emma's incredible leadership skills. In celebration of the COP26 meeting in Glasgow in November 2021, Emma thought that it would be great to hang patchwork banners down the front of the towers of New College, and that the patches themselves might come from students and local groups and churches. It's the sort of idea a lesser person might have shelved when the extent of health and safety issues connected with attaching lengthy banners to towers was revealed, but not Emma. And though I do suspect that the project caused a few sleepless nights, the sight of people from all over Scotland coming to New College with their 1 metre squares, sewing machines put up in the rainy hall, not to mention the banners in all their glory, was quite incredible. In her spare time, Emma likes cycling or walking in the Pentland Hills near her home and further afield in the Scottish countryside with her husband, Peter. She commutes to work on her bike and dreams of a day when there will be more bikes in Edinburgh than cars. To this end, she's an active member of Spokes, the Lothian Cycle Campaign. She's ecumenical in her Christian faith and likes to blend work and spiritual well-being by worshipping in churches with international roots. She tells me she particularly enjoys simple pleasures, curling up with a good novel and hanging out with family and friends. New College remains a special place where she made lifelong friends, many of them here in the room today, but most especially her husband, Peter. They met in 1988 in what is now the Althouse Reed Room. He had just returned from a year in Kenya, and she'd spent a summer in India and Pakistan, and the rest, as they say. He brought the wood, she made it wild. I'm sure that's an old joke. I'd like to give a special welcome to some of her guests. in particular her parents, Diana and Roger Wilde, who have come up from Scarborough. Sorry, Wood, you're Wood, not Wild. Oh no, you're Wild, you are Wild. Who've come up from Scarborough. Her husband, Peter Wood, and their children, who are also here, I think, Rory and Cameron. A particular mention to colleagues from other schools and colleges in the university, and friends and colleagues of Emma from around the world who will be listening to the recording. Hello to you especially. Finally, we're very pleased to be joined by David Maxwell, who is Dixie Professor in Ecclesiastical History and a Fellow of Emmanuel College at the University of Cambridge. David is a close colleague and mentor of Emma's, and I'm delighted now to hand over to David, who will say a few words of appreciation for Emma's scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. It's good to see some familiar faces and old friends. And it's a real pleasure to be able to congratulate Professor Wildwood on her inaugural lecture. I've been asked to speak for 3 to 5 minutes on Emma's scholarship, which is no easy task, but I will restrict myself to just one point. But it's a very significant one. Emma has been a pioneer of an innovative and insiderly model of African church history. She is, of course, interested in the antecedents of African churches, in missionary entanglements, but in her own work, in her own research, she foregrounds the agency of African Christians as religious consumers, religious practitioners, and missionaries in their own right. Emma writes wonderfully nuanced accounts of the ideas, the passions, the tensions that animate African church life. Her positionality and her methodology have been key to the success of this enterprise. Significantly, her first job as lecturer in the Provincial Theological College of the Anglican Church of the Congo placed her at the heart of the African church. And there she was able to conduct over 100 interviews, transcribe songs, which are often not ignored as sources, but are a brilliant window onto indigenous theology and spirituality. And she was able to, an ingenious source, mine 30 locally produced dissertations. The dissertations were a fabulous source, allowing her to access internal debates and polemics about what constituted authentic Congolese Anglicanism. And together these local sources enabled her to build a sophisticated, a multifaceted, a layered, dynamic account of the Anglican Church of the Congo, her first book. That book drew out tensions between indigenous Hema, younger Swahili-speaking labour migrants, revivalists and non-revivalists, modernisers and traditionalists. And we see Emma's great skill in reconstructing the fine grain of religious change in her abiding work on Apollo Kivibulaya, the Lugandan evangelist who founded Congolese Anglicanism. Her careful collaborative work with George Mpanga interrogates once again, a rich array of sources: Kivibulaya's diaries, his correspondence, unpublished local biographies, funeral eulogies, as well as interviews. And with this material, she's able to locate Kivibulaya within the East African tradition of spiritual expert, someone who's able to slay kings, bring rain, heal the sick. But while Emma has explored how Kivibulaya was viewed as a Congolese saint, as a culture hero, she's also significantly attentive to how he has become a global Anglican saint. Canonised in missionary writings, Kivy Bulaya has become a model of successful enculturation and an exemplar of devout Anglican service worldwide. When I showed a slide of Kivy Bulaya in a public lecture in Cambridge several years back, Archbishop Rowan Williams beamed with pleasure at seeing one of his own up there on the screen. And this brings us to Emma's more recent work on world Christianity. She's explored how local African Christians have consistently reached out to make connections with other churches across the globe, for resources, for ecumenical purposes, or simply for the sake of feeling part of something larger and weightier, the universal church. We see this theme of her work in her more recent interest, we see this more recent interest in connectivity and scale in her pioneering work on the East African revival. In local terms, which Emma's of course very interested in, she shows how the revival provides a rich set, a powerful set of idioms that enabled women and young men to break away from ancestor cults and to critique elder men who dominated the church. But she also shows how it was a shared discourse of renewal that allowed revivalists to make connections with their fellows across East Africa and to work closely with British missionaries and their European funders who staffed and supported the Rwandan mission. Emma is one of a small handful of scholars who have put revival on the scholarly agenda of African Christian studies. And so in her exemplary histories of the African church that are both grounded and rounded, Emma has developed two key themes: ecumenism and independency, the title of a recent collection she co-edited with Alex Chow. She began her career with independency, the urge towards distinction, towards plurality, towards contextual translation of the gospel, and more recently she's added ecumenism, the desire for unity, for collaboration, for connectivity, a connectivity that often includes a desire for shared belief and practice. And her focus on these two impulses has enabled her to reconstruct the history of the African church, warts and all, a community animated by tensions of class, ethnicity, gender, generation, theological disputation, but also a church inspired by remarkable figures such as Apollo Kivy Bulaya, and a church situated within a larger global communion. Professor Wood then stands in the best tradition of Edinburgh church historians. So can we now welcome Emma herself, who will speak on the topic of Entangled in Divinity, African Religions and World Christianity.
Well, thank you very, very much, Professor Bond, for your introduction, and Professor Maxwell for your kind words about my scholarship and for coming all the way from Cambridge for the occasion. It is just absolutely amazing to see you all, and thank you so much for coming. I see students and colleagues from Divinity, from African Studies, from SPS, from LLC, even from the College of Medicine and Vet Medicine at Glasgow University, supporters and committee members of the Centre for the Study of World Christianity, friends, all of you. I am very grateful for your support and friendship. It's rare that one's able to thank one's family publicly. Sorry, I've got quite emotional now. But my parents, Roger and Diana, have given me a lifetime of love and support, so thank you to you. And my husband, Peter, is my closest companion, who set down a job he enjoyed to move to Edinburgh with me 5 years ago. 2 of our 3 children are here, but I want to thank all three of them for taking me away from work, away from research very often, and giving me new perspectives on life. I would not know about citrus spruce or the Spider-Verse if it wasn't for Ruri and Cameron here. And Ruri's now clocked up 3 research trips, one which was with my sister Vicky because she was looking after him at the time. I have not shown you that photograph, but there are a number of photos here that the better composed photos you're going to see are thanks to Ruri, who's taken some of them. And I'd like also to express my gratitude to a number of people who I hope will be able to listen to the recording but can't be with us today. And they're the friends and colleagues who have most influenced my engagement with religions in Africa. Yeah, and please do shuffle along and find somewhere comfortable to sit. They have been most generous in their friendship. They've welcomed me into their homes, opened my mind and heart to new ways of living, and provided insights to their societies and cultures. And they include, as you can see from this photograph, Isangoma and Mugisa Kahwa. Isangoma was my first boss in Congo at ISTA. And here we are in Bunia back in February with other good friends, Kahwa and Jojo and Martin and Guba, almost 30 years from our first meeting. And on the right is Joyce Muhindo, with whom I wrote my first academic article, published in 1993 in the Yearbook of European Society of Women in Theological Church, which was co-edited by Charlotte Methuen, who's sitting there. So thank you for coming, Charlotte. On the left is Yossa Y, of more shortly. And here is Maturo, who spent hours patiently talking with me in Swahili whilst I slowly gained confidence in conversation. And her husband, Teacher Ande, my second boss, the rector of the college. We studied for our PhDs at the same time, him in Birmingham, and we chewed over our theses together. Mine became the book on the left that's already been mentioned. Ande's was published as Leadership and Authority, Bula Matari, which is the sort of name for the sort of strong autocratic government, and life, community, ecclesiology in Congo. When we were all teaching together in the 1990s, we discussed all sorts of things, including, apart from the sort of day-to-day things, how the curriculum could be changed to centre different topics and content, the advantages and disadvantages of teaching in a European language, it was French, the intersection between knowledge appropriate for a particular context and knowledge that crosses contexts. I learned so much from grappling with these issues with them, and I'm very grateful. And here's Dr. Yossa Y, again standing on the right, and Dr. Amuda Baba, a public health specialist, standing on the left, with a team of researchers in February, preparing a series of workshops and interviews on the understanding of disease among different faith communities. And this is a continuation of the COVID-19 project that Helen mentioned, and I'm delighted that Jean Benoit, who's been a real support in that project, is here from Centre of African Studies. Among less photogenic things, we published this little booklet for schools that is both in French and English, getting secondary school children to think about what it is to study religions and also where religion and health might meet. And we've just produced a very small pamphlet in French for primary school teachers to think about how they might intersect. They teach religious studies, they teach health to children, but where do those two things, where are the problems where those issues collide? You've also heard of George Mpanga, but I'd like to mention him here, pictured with the source book which we worked on together and the monograph on which his insights were invaluable. A big thank you to him, and there are so many others, but I'll mention only 3 now. Doctors Paddy Musana and Helen Nambolewa of Makerere University in Uganda, and Dr. Alois Ojure of Tangaza University College in Kenya. So if I can address them in the hope that they will see this, to you all, merci beaucoup, asante sana, awadifo, webalinyo, webalin mono. The title of my personal chair lays out quite practically and as succinctly as possible what I teach in the School of Divinity and where my research interests lie. That is to say, religions on the African continent and its diaspora, and these are mainly Christian, Muslim and indigenous religious traditions because they make up an estimated 98.7% of religious and non-religious adherents. And also Christian movements across the globe, particularly in the majority world. The title doesn't mention that I prefer to do this as a sort of modern contemporary social historian, but quite frankly, I did not want to add another syllable. I had tripped over the length of my previous title for several years, Senior Lecturer in African Christianity and African Indigenous Religions. I just watched people's eyes glazed over before I got halfway through it. But more significantly, by choosing this title, I've also made a conscious decision to centre the tensions that are inherent in what I do. Now, some of the tensions lie in the definition of religions and whether it's a useful term for beliefs and practices that the School of Divinity we tend to refer to as indigenous religions, or whether it ties those beliefs and practices too closely to a particular view of spiritual engagement that's linked to Western knowledge, production, and textual practices. Other tensions lie in what we mean by Africa and how far we essentialise things as African. Another set of tensions lie in combining the general term religions with a specific term, Christianity. This is a bit lopsided and open to reading African practices through a Judeo-Christian interpretation. And shortly I'll speak more about how conversely the study of African indigenous religions has shaped the study of world Christianity. Nevertheless, as you'll see, these tensions remain. Some tensions occur because of my own position. As a white British Christian woman, I have an uneven relationship with the subject. I can claim to be an insider of a very small corner of Christianity, but only a privileged outsider to religions in Africa. And so this puts me in the position of a perpetual apprentice who must sit at the feet of African scholars and practitioners to listen, absorb, participate, engage, to get something of that deep, empathetic learning. Now, today I'm not going to problematize these tensions any further. Rather, I will begin to show you how I work with these entangled tensions, how they offer for me a productive dialectic, and how they've come to be entangled in divinity, particularly this School of Divinity. This year, during 3 months of research in Kenya, Congo, and Uganda, I was struck again by the public nature of religious beliefs and practices in a way that contrasts starkly with Britain. As you can see from this slide, vehicles proclaim just prayers, Alhamdulillah, Inshallah, and Jaja Bamu. The latter is a reference to Bamuyana, who's a Ugandan spirit highly regarded by taxi drivers, hence on the back of the taxi, musicians, and those living with addiction. And along the high street, you might see signs like this. These are all from the sort of Kampala area. God's Mercy Supermarket, God With Us Plaza, and one of my particular favourites, the Faith School of Beauty. And even bins installed by the government use a religious register to promote litter picking and environmental awareness. So being lazy is a sin. This is a very visible spiritual framework to public and private life. I was hoping this slide would come later, but it's coming now. And here are some other ones that I'm going to talk about in a minute. The Emmanuel Medical School God's Will Medical Clinic, Praise God Clinic, and Divine Life Pharmacy, Jesus is Our Healer. And I can see some faces, familiar smiles on some people's faces, and so I know that these are not just East African signs, but you see them all over Nigeria and Ghana and West Africa as well. But you don't tend to see them in Britain, and that's an important contrast. Here's another image from my recent visit. This one comes from Miracle Centre in Kampala, a very large, well-known Pentecostal church that was, incidentally, established by a man called Robert Kayanja, who is the brother of the former Archbishop of York, John Sentamu. And he has another brother who started a very big church in the US as well. So very prominently displayed on the left-hand side of the big stage, and you can see I was sitting a bit far away, so it's a bit blurry, was an installation of medical supports, crutches, trusses, a wheelchair, all testament to healing expected at Miracle Centre through the power of the Holy Spirit. And during my visit, distressed individuals signalled their affliction through shaking and wailing. They were led forward to the preacher for prayer that frequently ended with them falling to the floor in a deep slumber. This image comes from about 50 kilometres away, near Mityana, at the Tanda Archaeological Archives, that's their name, a Buganda cultural site, where deep holes in the ground mark the site of a fight between the two sons of heaven, Gulu, and prominently displayed at the side of a pit dedicated to Wanema, who is the spirit of disability, and the main servant of Walumbe, the god disease, was an installation of medical supports. The wooden crutches and sticks are testament to the healing expected through offerings to Wanema. People brought offerings to the site following an interpretation of their dreams by a medium, and their affliction also might be manifest in bodily form. Pentecostal churches are likely to preach against spirits like Wanema and Walumbe as those who hamper healing and need to be exorcised. At Tanda, the spirits of disability and death are precisely the beings whom one should approach with offerings, guided by a medium. Both Miracle Centre and Tanda, however, are responding very immediately to a human quest for healing and wholeness. The discourse may be different, but the visual messages in the installation and the bodily responses of the afflicted may appear very, very similar. So expectations collide and coalesce across religious traditions. And afflicted people may seek healing in both these places. And they may also go to the many hospitals and clinics where prayer is offered side by side with medical treatment. And at this point, I was going to show you my earlier slide, I got in the wrong order, with those names of clinics, Emmanuel Medical Centre and Praise God Clinic and so forth. So those seeking cures have a large repository of options, although some options are naturally viewed with suspicion by some groups. Pentecostal members are warned against attending traditional sites, but in contrast at Tanda, Christians and Muslims are welcome. The medium I met here explained that he was a Muslim who'd been repeatedly disturbed by dreams, and he could only understand them by going to Tanda. And here we see the Bible and the Quran displayed at the shrine of Kintu and Nyambe. Kintu is the first man and his divine wife, the daughter of heaven, of Gulu. And so regardless of prior affiliation, people are encouraged to come to those sites alongside their Christian or Muslim belief. And also, regardless of their affiliation, those seeking help might be directed to Undahura, the Muslim God, that's what he's called, or asked to offer Muslim prayers, and here is a prayer mat. So while some people wish to make a clear distinction between their beliefs and practices and those of others, they are nevertheless often entangled in the search for health and well-being. And they can be entangled in rejection, in affinities across religious traditions, and in borrowing between different religious traditions. Those are all part of the mix, and a point I'll mention at the end. So this idea of entanglement has been a helpful concept for historians studying the intersection of different cultures and societies, and a recent example is Professor Maxwell's book on religious entanglements in Congo. Entanglement, for those not kind of familiar with it, recognises that categories used to delineate sets of things frequently create artificial boundaries that require interrogation. An object of study, therefore, is constituted at the meeting point of various contexts. Entanglement acknowledges that human agency is a condition of interdependency, one which operates within and between social groups who possess different sorts of power. Exploring the points at which faith beliefs and practices cross over with health beliefs and practices, for example, acknowledges an entanglement that is both transcultural and transdiscursive. That is, it shows how embodied cultural performance and theological and scientific debates are part of a plurality of interactions. Entanglement is able to plot nuance and shift in asymmetries of power in colonial and post-colonial societies. A third element of entanglement has been called diachronic, and that's an acknowledgement that the discussion of the past that uses concepts and language of the present necessarily alters our understanding of the past. So in that process of communication, we're also changing things. And likewise, the translation of terms from Bantu or Nilotic languages, for example, into those of Western Europe can displace meaning as much as explain it. And I want to give you a brief example from my recent book that David mentioned, in which cultural and discursive entanglements are at play. So the Reverend Apollo Chivubulaya, who's in the centre there, was a priest in the Anglican Church until his death in 1933. Like many other Christians of his generation, he was persuaded of the benefits of biomedicine. In his youth, he had been an apprentice to a traditional healer, or Muswa, or Mufumu, or even Muganga. Later, he critiqued the efficacy of the practices he'd learned. He also distinguished himself from independent Christians in Uganda known as the Malachites, who rejected all forms of healing. On his preaching tours in the Ituri forest of Congo, Chivubulaya administered basic remedies provided by the new kind of Omuswao, Muganga, Ufumu. All these words are words that he was using at the same time, but they're in different languages. These new kind of doctors were at the missionary hospital in Fort Portal, Uganda. And with these remedies that he had, he prayed for and tended to the sick, and he dressed their wounds. And Chivubulaya is in many ways an excellent example of the rupture and social change that Christianity brought. And a shout out to Naomi Haynes and the Anthropologists of Christianity for their work on that. But however, Chivubulaya's medical approach was also entangled in a long-standing pragmatic approach to healthcare, one that expected divine intervention for well-being at times of personal and communal suffering. As you've heard already, he did indeed throw a curse on a king, and it was successful. The king died, and he made rain. And because his rainmaking powers worked, and the the medium's brain-making powers in this particular recorded incident didn't, he seemed more powerful and more persuasive. The young men and women who became his apprentices later testified to the power of Chivubulaya's prayers and also the power of his presence to heal the sick, to bring peace and also social order. That's all an arc of what health means. Their stories of Chivubulaya's mediation of divine power place the cure of individual sickness together with the corporate prayers for rain and the protection of gardens from wild pigs. New and old knowledge and vocabulary about healing, about spiritual causality and power are entangled. There's an interplay between local and transnational factors. The sources that we look at show different levels of entanglement and disentanglement at work. You've got Chivubulaya, who's using medical treatments introduced by Western missionaries and trying to foreground that part of his work. But those who followed him were understanding his authority in terms associated with traditional forms of healing and divining that required spiritual power over the environment and over political leaders. So the history of religious change presupposes an understanding of how that change interacts with long-standing beliefs and practice. And I think this is an important tenet of the study of world Christianity more broadly. And this is where I want to talk about how the study of world Christianity is influenced by the significance of the African continent and an Africanist scholarly agenda. Now, this close association is not without its critics or a critique, not least in the book that David Maxwell, Joël Kabuta and I co-edited, Relocating World Christianity, which came out of a project in which we talked to lots of scholars from all different parts of the world. But today I'm wanting to focus on the influence in the school through the Centre for the Study of World Christianity. So the centre, which is how I'm going to abbreviate it rather than stumbling over its long title, is 40 years old this year. It moved to the University of Edinburgh in 1987, and it began with an even longer title in 1983, the Centre for the Study of Christianity in the Non-Western World, and it started in the University of Aberdeen. It was established by Andrew Walls, a church historian who'd already spent quite some time in Sierra Leone and in Nigeria. And in 1970, he'd set up the first religious studies department in Scotland. The first one in the UK was in Lancaster just a couple of years beforehand. He later became the president of the British Association of Religious Studies, as it's now known. 3 years previously, in 1967, Walls had founded the Journal of Religion in Africa. And he drew together in Aberdeen a host of scholars and also of PhD students. So Lamin Sane, Adrian Hastings, Kwame Bediako, and many others who introduced some key ideas. Here is Lamin Sane on the translatability of Christianity into vernacular idioms, which in turn domesticated or enculturated Christian practices, and also the local agency in religions in Africa, in new religious movements, and in mission-initiated churches. I've just got two very pithy quotes. The adoption of the vernacular was tantamount to adopting indigenous cultural criteria, a piece of radical indigenization, which he says produced profound confidence in converts. And another point is in this slide, in which Kwame Bediako talks about a serious theological encounter and cross-fertilization between Christian religion and indigenous religions to create a theology of continuity and dialogue, which requires an understanding of African communities. And my own supervisor, Jack Thompson, a historian of Malawi, was very much of this mould. But we see other predecessors who have worked in the centre taking slightly different angles. For example, Professor Afe Odogame and Professor James Cox, through their scholarship and their networking, they set out different agendas. So Professor Cox, who retired in 2011, focused in the latter part of his career increasingly on indigenous religions across the globe, including Canada and Australia, interests that have been taken in new directions by Drs. Longkumar and Ghosh. In 1992, however, Cox had been among the founding members of the African Association for the Study of Religions. And in 1993, he came to the centre from the University of Zimbabwe to coordinate the large-scale African Christianity project that ran from 92 to 98, funded by Pew charitable trusts and with partners in Ghana in the universities of Malawi, Namibia, Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and also a university in Mozambique. Quite a range. Afe Odogame, now at Princeton Theological Seminary, focused on African migration and diaspora religions in Europe and North America. And his work was very much part of a wider move from a commitment to fine-grained local and regional studies to a focus on transnational interconnectedness, hybridity, and transcultural concerns. Theological thought informed by African cultures continues to influence world Christianity. And I'd like to give a very current example. Later this month, we will hold the 31st, I think, Yale-Edinburgh World Christianity and History of Mission Conference here in New College. It will be the second hybrid format conference with plenaries streamed from Sao Paulo, Nairobi, and Singapore. And this year's theme addresses one of the most pressing issues of our time, planetary health and the climate emergency. And on the 24th of June, as you can see, Professor Stanchu Ilo, a renowned Catholic theologian, will speak on cosmic flourishing and Ubuntu ethics of creation, collective ownership and responsibility. Ubuntu, peoplehood, speaks of a community-focused ethics. The Swahili proverb is mutu ni watu, a person is people. And this ethic has really interested philosophers and lawyers and theologians, and they found it very generative in response to social challenges. And as you'll guess from this slide, this is basically a shameless plug for this year's Alexander Duff Lecture, which is part of the conference that's open to the public. Alexander Duff, by the way, was the first professor of evangelistic theology from 1867 to 78 here in New College. He had previously established English medium schools and a focus on higher education in Calcutta, India, and had significant influence on educated elites. The chair actually only lasted until 1892, but the lectures continue and are on the gift of the Church of Scotland. Thank you, Ian Alexander. By the accounts of his Edinburgh students, Alexander Duff was indeed a Duff lecturer. But the same cannot be said for subsequent lectures made in his name, and I'm sure Stanchu Ilo will be really well worth coming to hear, so do come along to that. But to return to the development of the centre, I think its first title is very instructive. The term non-Western was deployed to challenge the normativity of Eurocentric subjects, categories, and objectives. The centre was intended to listen to movements and to scholarships that had been ignored in the Western Academy, particularly in theology and religious studies, and thus educate the Western Academy about Christian movements and their contexts outside the West, showing the diversity of new theologies and practices. Now here's the description of the centre by Walls, the interdisciplinary study of the Christian faith in its worldwide manifestations and its relations to other faiths and cultures. Originally, he said it at his inaugural lecture here. So the centre develops an approach that was interdisciplinary at a time when interdisciplinarity was still relatively novel. It bridged religious studies and theology when many scholars claimed distinct disciplinary paths. It focused on the knowledge and faith perspective of insiders when the value of scholarly objectivity and secularity was only beginning to be scrutinised. And it recognised the dangers of marginalising certain scholars, those who are activist in intent and committed to the outcomes they propose as a response to immediate problems facing their own religious traditions and societies. It critiqued unified global expressions of Christianity that had emerged from European thought and institutional organisation, whilst also working within many of those networks. In 1995, in the edition of the first issue of the journal Studies in World Christianity, which I now co-edit with Dr. Alex Chow, the founding editor, who was Professor James Mackey, the Dean of Divinity, who actually gave the centre its Edinburgh home, set out a vision to promote theology, or science of religion, by providing a truly international forum in which a true dialogue of equals can take place. It attempted to situate Christianity in a relationship with other religious traditions with which it interacted, acknowledging that Christianity had already been encountering other faith traditions in religiously plural settings when that still seemed rather novel in much of the global north. And so when I was studying at the centre, and I actually audited a whole load of classes when Peter was doing his master's here, but as a postgraduate student, I was really struck by the lively discussions around the course content, the research methods, in which students questioned methodologies, questioned reading lists, questioned the form and nature of the knowledge they were expected to produce for master's and PhD theses. Debates 30 years ago on knowledge production in the academy that have recently become quite mainstream. And I learned a great deal from my fellow students then, and many of them, over the years, have taken up important roles in the church, in the academy, and in civil society, and even sometimes go on to found centres of world Christianity themselves. I'd just like to mention one. At the end of semester one next year, the university will confer an honorary doctorate on Professor Esther Mombo of St Paul's University, Kenya, for her services to theological education, female empowerment, inclusion, and, with apologies to staff who can't bear to hear these two words together any longer, curriculum transformation. Esther's challenges to the patriarchy and white privilege remain as trenchant as ever. She has immersed herself in established structures in order to change them from the inside. And here's another shameless plug. She's also, hot off the press, going to give the Cunningham Lecture here when she's receiving her honorary degree. The title change to the Centre of the Study of World Christianity came in 2009, just in case you're wondering, under the directorship of Brian Stanley. And the name change again is significant. It recognised the dangers of essentialising what was Western or African or Asian or non-Western. And it also acknowledged that the West cannot examine the rest as if it stood outside that history. And it also recognised the importance of regional and international networks and movements. Now, I did, this is the research for this lecture. I ran the titles of all the PhD theses that the centre had done that I could find, which is probably not all of them, through this word cloud, and came up with these So not a full list, but I think I found it very instructive. Obviously, we're only working with titles. It only tells us so much. But the first thing I'd like to point out is what you can't really see. Because once I'd done this, I thought, well, is this actually any use? Because so many key words came up only once. Incredible diversity of PhD topics is the first thing to say. The words are so small that you cannot see the subjects, the locations, even the sort of approaches that students have taken. What is clear is the preponderance of work on Protestant, evangelical, or mission and theology, quite a lot of places in Africa and also Korea, China and India. And the church also looms large, and churches. So there's clearly some work to be done if we're thinking about world Christianity. Pentecostalism is just about visible. Not much on Catholicism. Fortunately, Pani is putting that to rights. And nothing on Orthodoxy. So we've got some work to do. Also absent are some of these themes of translation and language, although there is something on migration diaspora here that is quite interesting. The other thing that struck me was that there's a real focus on culture rather than religious traditions. And I hope you've gathered from what I've said so far that actually those two categories are often so entangled that it's quite hard to separate them out. But this is also about, I think, our engagement on the African continent. This cultural religious interface is very, very strong. And so when individual ethnic groups are named in the very small print, these are it can be things we might put in the cultural bracket, or things we might put in the religious bracket. But actually, those brackets are sort of collapsed a little bit. But there's few theses, well, there are one or two that engage with Hinduism and Islam directly, but not so many. And so that's another area, perhaps, of looking back in some ways to how the centre was set up and what Mackie and Walls kind of had in mind. But that's perhaps enough of the past. I've given you a sort of very brief overview of entanglement of religions in Africa and world Christianity here. But I want to mention one or two current developments, both practical and then perhaps thinking a little bit more conceptually. On Saturday, so bang up to date, the Centre held a workshop called Global Christians in Edinburgh, led by Dr. Alex Chow and Noam Hatzor, which brought mainly migrant leaders in the city together. And the idea was to listen to the diverse ways in which migrant and international churches have formed in Edinburgh. And at the risk of embarrassing the students, this is our debrief. This wasn't the actual workshop, but this was the debrief in Princess Street Gardens. You remember Saturday was a lovely day. It felt wrong to keep people cooped up here. But we at the workshop, we were exploring what kind of inclusion the new Scots, to use government terminology, consider. What the kind of inclusion they have ecumenically and with wider society, and how their local presence is often intertwined with geopolitical concerns. All I can say at this point is watch out for future developments on this project. Second, Dr. Pedro Viatosa and I, with Kirsty Stewart, the New College archivist, hope to address the amazing centre collections. Almost 8% of the university's special collections come from the School of Divinity. And the centre collections make up over half of the Divinity collections. They include Missionary Society archives and pamphlets and ephemera from across the globe. Now, a previous generation of academics and librarians ensured that these documents survived. It seems to me that our generation needs to find ways of making them more accessible to communities across the globe who can't always come to Edinburgh to read them. We don't know how we're going to do this yet. Well, do we? But it's another important part of our engagement beyond the university. And finally, to return to my theme of entanglement that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, the dynamics of religious plurality is a focus of continued importance. I'm quite interested in these intersections of health and faith, but I see this emerging with the monograph series that I co-edit, and I see Barbara Bompani over there, who's one of my co-editors, through James Curry. It's called Religion in Transforming Africa, one of those titles that you're meant to kind of think about. Ordinary interactions, comparisons and critiques take place, as I hope I've shown with my earlier slides, with substantial numbers of Christians, Muslims and practitioners of African religious traditions who live alongside each other and relate to each other in multiple ways. So comparing religions is not just a scholarly activity, but something that happens in everyday life as people situate their own ideas and practices in relation to others. And on this slide, just some of the books, Nolte and Oghen, in the main slide, provide a multifaceted study of interreligious coexistence in Nigeria that deliberately questions dominant narratives of religious tensions in that country and also in popular discourse around those sort of roles of religions in societies that anticipate a clash of civilizations. And the latest one, hot off the press, by Naomi Pendle, discusses the way in which the tangled religious traditions in South Sudan help to contest what she calls violent peacemaking of politicians. They're a kind of counterbalance to what is going on in a political sphere. These kind of issues, of course, are important across the globe. And in the School of Divinity today, we have an increasingly diverse range of disciplines and approaches. If I just say Islam, Christian, Muslim relations, Jewish network, Buddhist studies network, the entanglement of science and religion, and the entanglement of religion and literature, we can see that it is so much more diverse than 30 years ago. And each one of us has a deep knowledge of perhaps one or two traditions, texts, philosophies, beliefs, practices, relations with politics and society. We don't always talk about where they're entangled with each other. What does it look like to have multiple religious belongings or to live in contradistinction to a particular religious tradition? And in a secular Scottish university, the discussion of religious adherence can cause embarrassment. Yet, that's not how most of the world operates. What can we learn from different cultures and societies about how we discuss different religious beliefs and practices? And as we're asked to consider our impact of our world beyond the academy, I look forward to more active interreligious conversation, inclusive of non-religious ideas amongst ourselves, and more intentional work with members of religious traditions. Now, I started with some thank yous and acknowledgements, and it's getting quite hot in here, so we need to go to the rainy hall where it will be several degrees cooler. I'd like to finish with some more quick thank yous, particularly aimed at those in Divinity, the academic and professional services colleagues and students. Now, I'm very grateful to have had a long association with the school. When I came as an undergraduate in 1987, it was a warm and welcoming place. And here's the least embarrassing photograph I could find of those days. And you'll see I just put Professor Brown and Professor Hardman Moore, who recently retired and from whom I learned so much about church history, and it's Professor John O'Neill who's in the middle there. I'm delighted that many undergraduate students today still testify to the community spirit of learning and common endeavour. And I also learn a great deal from postgraduate students, particularly those I supervise. For 3 years, as Helen mentioned, I was Director of Postgraduate Studies, and the very best part of that role was interacting with postgraduate students across the school and seeing the development of their projects. Our international, interreligious body of postgraduate students gives the school life and vigour, and it's particularly pleasing to have the part-time distance students and the Pittsburgh programme students with us this week. There are 23 current Masters and PhD students in the centre, and this is us at a seminar back in lockdown. I hope it doesn't cause traumatic memories. There were a few more people in the room, but there was no way of getting them on the photo. And their projects are as diverse and varied as their predecessors. Media, migration, violence, Christian culture, so many different topics. And they're also using new techniques to discuss the questions that arise from their research. And I'd like to acknowledge, as a particularly good example, the excellent work of Noam Hatzor, Chow Ma, and Tu Elias in establishing the podcast Voices in World Christianity. If you want to know more about the subject and what students who are studying it think about it and who they like to talk to, look up the podcast. It's well worth listening to. I am really grateful to my colleagues in Divinity. Staff backgrounds and interests, as I've already said, are much more diverse than they were 30 years ago, and it's been particularly pleasing this academic year to welcome so many new colleagues. And despite the apparently never-ending building project and all the pressures in the university that so often distance us from students and from one another, I am very pleased to say that here in Divinity we can still enjoy excellent scholarly discussions and a good time. And this is really something to be cherished. And in gratitude of that level of collegiality, I'm going to leave you with a photograph of some of us enjoying the New College Ball last month.
All that remains is to thank you, Emma, so much for tonight's lecture. It was entertaining and erudite, and you've really, I think, given us a sense of your research and also, more importantly than that, your passion for it, what drives you. So, in short, a splendid inaugural lecture. All that remains now, I think, is to invite you all to the Rainy Hall for refreshments, where you can continue the conversation with one another and with Emma. So can we thank Emma one last time?